Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Well, children's literature could simply be seen as a way to entertain and teach children, which in and of itself would make it an important genre. But in seeking to shape the next generation, children's literature is much more: a reflection of history, lessons from today's culture, and a map of society's goals for the future. Dr. Miriam Udel, Associate Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture at Emory University, with a PhD in Comparative Literature from Harvard University, has focused on the intersection of Judaism and modernity in her work. Her research includes 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, and American Jewish literature and genre studies. In Dr. Udel's new book, Honey on the Page, a Treasury of Yiddish Children's Literature, she offers nearly 50 Yiddish stories and poems that illustrate the rich and varied heritage of Jewish culture around the world. A scholar and award-winning author, Dr. Udel guides readers back in time, sharing the richness of Jewish life through Yiddish children's literature with English readers as never before. Dr. Udel joins me now to discuss Honey on the Page, an extraordinary collection of children's stories and poems, and the significance of her groundbreaking work. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, your new book, Honey on the Page, brings literature to young people in a digestible manner. And my first question to you has got to be, as it always is, what was the motivation for this particular book?
Sure. So I started working on this book in 2013. I had just finished writing a pretty technically ambitious monograph about Yiddish modernism. And I needed a palate cleanser. I was teaching Yiddish language at the time, as well as courses in literature and culture in translation. And I also had two very young children. One of those children is now 17 and the other is 13. So you can, do the math, and they were both quite young. And at a sort of a convergence point of my work as a language instructor and my vocation as a mother, I found myself wondering, has there ever been any literature written for children in Yiddish? Because it wasn't something that was part of my own Yiddish education. And when I started looking for it, I found it very rapidly, because not only does it exist, but it's been digitized. There is a huge repository on the website of the Yiddish Book Center of freestanding picture books, storybooks, anthologies, books of poetry, plays, and they're all just sitting there waiting for somebody to do something with them. And I saw that very little had been done in the way of either scholarship or translation that would make these works accessible to contemporary speakers of English. And I thought, okay, well, someone's got to do this. Why not me?
Well, let's talk a little bit before we continue. Let's talk a little bit about Yiddish, which is a very expressive language. It's a very rich language. And of course, with the passage of time, with the Holocaust, first of all, decimating European Jewry, Yiddish speakers. And then the passage of time here, we're now over 100 years, more than 100, 130 or 40 years into our major immigration to this country. Yiddish has, to a certain extent, been marginalized, and there have been many attempts to bring it back. There's a lot of interest, renewed interest in it. What brought you to Yiddish? Was it something in your family? Did you hear it spoken, or you just found this something fascinating and interesting?
So I really only ever heard a word or two here or there, often in kind of dicey driving situations as expletives. I didn't have any sort of living Yiddish linguistic tradition in my own family. I became very interested as a post-undergraduate, kind of before I decided to go to graduate school. When I was thinking about it, I became very interested in the historical process of secularization. and how the contemporary Jewish community had come to look as it does, and also why literature became a kind of a zone where we work through moral questions. I went to a public high school, and if you think about, a large urban or suburban public high school, there's probably not a philosophy class. There's probably not a religion class. There might be some sort of a comparative religion survey. Um, there there are lots of ways that people have traditionally reasoned through moral questions that we don't really teach explicitly in high school, but we do teach moral reasoning. We do it in our English classes, in our literary studies. And I wanted to understand why that was so. And I decided when I had determined to apply to graduate school that that was going to be the question I would investigate. So it was really when I had a conversation with the Yiddishist Ruth Weiss, who ended up becoming my doctoral advisor, my Doktormame, as we might say in Yiddish. She said, secularization occurred so rapidly in the Yiddish-speaking sphere. You like languages. Why don't you go study Yiddish and see if it appeals to you and if that might be a way of getting at these questions that you find so interesting? And that's exactly what I did.
Well, I think it's so important, really, that there are scholars such as yourself who have devoted so much time and energy, research to the Yiddish language, which perpetuates it in so many different ways. And this book is a good example of that. And back to the book. What space does this collection of Yiddish literary texts for children actually fill? In other words, what was missing from the Yiddish literary experience for English speakers, particularly American Jews, in your view? I mean, we have so many children's books out there in English. So what space does the Yiddish literary experience fill for children?
Sure. So I want to address that question in a couple of different ways. Um, First of all, um, we have a lot of Hanukkah stories, right? We have so many Hanukkah stories. Hanukkah is not actually that big a deal on the Jewish calendar, but of course, for Jews living in America with what we call the December dilemma, where everything is, Christmas and tinsel from the minute Halloween ends through the new year, of course, Hanukkah became a large focus in American Jewish culture. But what about our Passover stories and our Shavuot or Shavuot stories? What about stories for Lag BaOmer, which was really conceived of and functioned as a children's holiday in Jewish Eastern Europe? We don't have so many of those. So in a way, Yiddish offers us a kind of a shortcut for getting back to a more expansive vision of Jewish life that is less conditioned by the particularities of living alongside American Christianity with its very kind of commercial focus. So that's one thing that, one kind of space that the book occupies. And the other way that I would answer this question is to point to the difficulty that I had finding a publisher for this book initially, because people kept asking me, well, is it a children's book or is it a book for adults? And the answer that I have clung to in a really kind of stubborn, maybe we'll say steadfast way, is that it's both. That I'm really envisioning an older kind of reading experience where there was less segmentation in the market. There was less stratification where a child would have no reason to look into an adult book and an adult would have no reason to poke their nose into whatever the kids were reading. I'm looking back to a time when generations really shared shared their lives more, shared their living conditions, and as a function of that, also shared stories more. So this is a book for all kinds of different readers of multiple generations, and ideally a book for members of those different generations to really be engaging in together.
Well, tell us about the origin of these Yiddish children's stories. Were they inspired by subjects described by famous Yiddish authors like Sholem Aleichem or Ayel Peretz, or perhaps by the myths or the fables of other cultures, American authors? What are the origin of the stories that you've selected for the book?
Yeah, so all of the above. I cannot emphasize enough how varied and diverse these stories and poems are in terms of the genres that they belong to, the places of publication, the places being represented, the authors who were writing them. But the the sort of core fact here is that most of this literature grows out of a an engagement with politics and political life. That's because these stories were created for use in Yiddish speaking schools and after schools in Europe, in Warsaw and in Vilna. They were full day private schools. There was no public compulsory education. In the United States, they were after schools. And these schools arose as networks that grew out of political ideologies and political parties. So there was a socialist oriented school network, there was a communist oriented school network, there was a Zionist oriented school network, there was a just plain Yiddish culture oriented school network. And each one of those had a publishing house that was attached to it and really promulgated their own publications for children, just as they had their own newspapers that adults might be reading. And so there was this really kind of rich, raucous political life that speakers of Yiddish were involved in, and that gave rise to a lot of children's culture.
You reference theorists like Michel Foucault and Walter Benjamin, and the ways that they compare the experience of the child reader to a mystical journey that transforms the world. Did you keep that in mind as you were writing Honey on the Page? And how did it affect your interpretation of the stories, the plays, and the poems that you include in the book?
Yeah, so one of the really important kind of dividing lines for these authors who were so ideologically engaged and aware was questions around the optimal aesthetics for children's literature and whether it should be whimsical, imaginative, mystical, or whether it should be ultra realistic and modern and portraying the kinds of situations that children would actually encounter in a thoroughly modern New York or modernizing Warsaw. And we really see both of these tendencies and everything in between represented. And I tried that, that's one of the forms of kind of aesthetic diversity that I tried to represent as I was crafting the table of contents and really selecting the materials that would be represented in Honey on the Page. There are definitely stories with a mystical bent. I'm thinking of Sholem Ash and a wonderful story called The Magnet of Jerusalem, where this very wealthy man really needs to lose his wealth and become an itinerant beggar in order to kind of develop the muscle of empathy that will make him a truly generous person. And that one is very mystically told, all the way over to a story from interwar Warsaw about a little girl getting lost, trying to follow her brother to school one day and getting lost on the streets of Warsaw, and her parents placing an ad in the newspaper in the classified section that, looking for their little girl. And that, of course, is how she's actually found through this kind of ultra modern institution of the newspaper classified. And we have, as I said, everything in between.
How far back do the stories go? What are the oldest stories that you've included in this collection?
So the oldest story is by Mordechai Spector, and it's a Purim story called Kids. And I love it because it is a story where children are actually really empowered to lead with kindness. It's about two elementary aged boys who are best friends who end up being sent on a fundraising mission on Purim by old Schmedel, the water carrier, who is raising his orphaned grandchildren. And he can't afford a pair of shoes for the eldest girl, who is of an age where she's basically been imprisoned in their home, in their hovel, for want of a pair of shoes during the winter. And so these two boys go out making Purim visits and asking for alms for the sake of this little girl. And nobody takes them seriously because they're just kids until they meet up with a cobbler in the marketplace who tells them, you have to stop going to the homes of the rich. You have to go to the homes of the simple Jews and state your errand. And they might not be able to give you much, but they won't turn you away empty-handed. The rich people think the world is their plaything, but the people of modest means, they'll get you what you need. And that story is from the 1890s. And it's really a precursor because this is a literature that starts developing in a serious way after World War I. It picks up a little bit in Europe during World War I, around 1911, 1914. And then this drip drop of a few stories here, a few poems there, becomes a flood in the 1920s and 30s.
Let's talk about gender and how boys and girls are treated in these stories. Talk to us about the world of boys historically and the cheters they attended. We talked before the program. My father told me in cheder how there was honey on the page. I think he said it was actually on the cover of the book, probably on the first day in cheder, or when they had completed a certain lesson or something. Tell us about that and the world of girls. How did that work, and how did it play out in the stories that you have covered here?
So the educational world of young boys, depending on time and place, sometimes as young as 3, but more typically 4 or 5, that world was dominated by the institution that you mentioned, the cheder, which is a Yiddish and a Hebrew word meaning room, because it was a fairly informal schoolroom in the home of the teacher. And it was a feature of Eastern European Jewish life pretty much everywhere you go. It is discussed in every memoir written by a Yiddish writer or other kind of cultural figure. And yes, there was a ceremony of initiation that by the 19th century involved taking honey, maybe some raisins, some other dried fruit, something sweet, and putting it right on the primer, the book that was going to be used to inculcate basic literacy so that learning would always be sweet. And I've actually just been doing some reading about pre-modern or early modern, before the 19th century, Jewish practices around the initiation of Torah study. And I learned about other kinds of variations on this theme where maybe some dried fruits and nuts would be showered down from above on the little boys as if they were being provided by the angels who were going to accompany them throughout the journey that they would trace through their studies. So this is really a very long-standing custom for boys. Now, the education of girls was much more haphazard, and it depended very heavily on the socioeconomic status of a given family. People who could afford it would hire tutors for their daughters, who would often come to the private home. There, by the turn of the 20th century, there were efforts underway in the Pale of Settlement and in Poland to establish schools for girls. So there was some girls' schooling happening by the 1890s, but what we see reflected in the Yiddish literature of the modern period, what I've included in Honey on the Page, is really a very striking gender split in terms of what gets represented, because we have a lot of stories for boys, some of which were published as late as the 1970s, nostalgic stories that represent those years in cheder, sometimes in the actual institution of the cheder, sometimes just the social milieu of a bunch of cheder boys, schoolboys, hanging out together outside of school. Whereas for girls are very seldom represented in any kind of a grouping or institution. Girls are often represented as being on their own. And they are, and this is something that I'm writing a chapter about for the critical study that will follow up on Honey on the Page. Girls are represented as being out of doors or as being lost, being in the wrong place, not being where they are supposed to be.
Well, it seems as if the authors and the parents, perhaps, hope that the children's books would motivate their readers to find their place in the new world, be it one where democracy, or Zionism, or socialism dominated. Did things change as the years passed? For example, were the children in the 1940s getting the same instructions or having the same role models as children 25 or 30 years before? How did that change over time?
That is a great question. So one of the ways that Yiddish literature had to reckon with history and with historical change before Jewish children's literature in English did was that they had to process the events of the Holocaust in real time. It was spoken of in Jewish, they were called shulas, the Jewish after schools that were affiliated with these various political and ideological movements. The events were spoken of. There was no attempt to hide them, to soften them, to distance them. And so in 1941, Isaac Metzger publishes a life of Don Yitzchak Abravanel, Isaac Abravanel, who was the intellectual and political leader of Iberian Jewry at the time of the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain. Now, it is absolutely a biography of Abravanel, but it's published in 1941. It's also implicitly and unavoidably a book about racially motivated violence against the Jewish community. How could it not be a Holocaust book? And there's a chapter where Isaac Abravanel is imagined to have kind of rubbed shoulders with this crazy young upstart who is hanging around the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, trying to raise money for this harebrained scheme to sail around to India by going west, which everybody just thought was like, who is this guy? What is he after? And he had these crazy ideas about how the world was round instead of flat. And Abravanel thought that this actually kind of made sense. And the chapter speculates that crazy guy, Christopher Columbus, was going to go and discover a continent that would become a home for freedom and perhaps even a refuge for Jews like the Jews who were starting to flee Spain many centuries hence, right? In other words, that language gets kind of stolen into this story about the 15th century. So at the time of these events, there was an awareness and a reckoning. And then what happens in the immediate post-war period in the 1950s is that we really see a return to and an embrace of Jewish holiday tales, albeit in a kind of secular key. So there's a really strong desire for Yiddish speaking children in the 1950s to know their way around the Jewish calendar, and all of the motifs, even of the lesser known holidays, the holidays that were not Hanukkah.
Well, we assume that children's literature is only for children, but that's not really the case here. Why is it is important for older readers, and not just younger ones, to enjoy the stories that you include in Honey on the Page?
So I think it is important for two reasons. One of them is historical, just to understand Jewish modernity, to understand where the Jewish community has been and what are the forces that have shaped it. Children's literature is a really important archive for that process of kind of historical self-understanding, certainly for the American Jewish community, because so much of it was produced here. So much of what was written in Europe, published in Europe, and then after the war in Latin America, continued to be consumed here. So that's one reason. Just the same way that we would reckon with any group of sources that are important to understanding our own history. But the second, it really has to do with very contemporary and future oriented concerns. In every generation, we have to rethink questions of what it means to transmit Jewish heritage, Jewish identity, Jewish values. And we really, I could phrase it in the negative or in the positive. I could say that we really hamper ourselves, hobble our own possibilities when we neglect wholesale the record of how we've tried to do this before. Or I could say it, much more positively, that we gain a tool of extraordinary potency for ourselves in those efforts when we pay attention, when we find a way to connect with the efforts that have been made in the past. And of course, I think that translation is one of those great modalities for helping us to do exactly that.
Well, you've talked about the different eras in which these stories came from, but we often reflect, many times we reflect on what would have happened had there been no Holocaust. Um, Jewish population today in the world, instead of being 15 million, would probably be 30 million. Um, Warsaw would have, I'm sure, continued to grow in terms of its importance as kind of the second New York, or maybe even New York being the second Warsaw. But of course, that was not to be. But have you ever thought about, given the prolific nature of Yiddish literature, Yiddish journalism, Yiddish theater, have you ever speculated on what might have been had the Holocaust not taken place?
Very often. And to the Holocaust, I really have to add the violence and depredations of Stalin, because that also decimated a really large and lively population of Yiddish speakers, but not just the speakers who are consuming this literature, the writers, in too many instances, who were producing it. And these kind of twin catastrophes of the Holocaust and Stalinist purges, um, yeah, I mean, it's just inestimable, the loss. The most immediate way that I feel it as a researcher of Yiddish children's literature is that, of course, when you study a corpus of literature, you want to also study its reception. You want to know, well, where are the memoirs of the people who read these stories and grew up to do great and exciting things for the Jewish world, or for the world at large. The child who reads a nonfiction scientific work in Yiddish and goes on to be a scientist who makes a wonderful discovery, or the child who is transfixed by the fairy tales, the silly Chalm stories, the poetry, and goes on to become a magnificent poet or novelist in her own right. And we simply don't have those. I study a literature where so much of the literature survived, but its natural readership did not. And it's incredibly poignant. And I feel that I'm motivated in a really powerful way by a desire for at least partial restoration. Maybe there had to be this multi-general break where these stories fell out of circulation and wide use, but maybe we can get back some kind of a readership for them, and kind of at least stitch together some of that torn fabric.
Acclaimed children's book artist Paula Cohen provides illustrations for Honey on the Page. What do her illustrations bring to your book, and why did you choose her to complement the stories in it? Tell us a little more about the collaboration process.
Sure. So I'm going to try to hold up some images of Paula's. This is the rabbi riding on the lion on Saturday night to catch up with the caravan in the desert. This is my spirit animal. This is a little girl named Sprinze who loves to read so much that she will go anywhere, including to the top of a lamppost, in order to just read her book unmolested. So Paula's illustrations add something indispensable to the book. They add the whimsy and the sense of just a child's eye. They add delight. It is about 350 pages. It's a little bit of a tome, as you can see. There is some original artwork from 85 and 100 years ago, and it's wonderful. But it's also very much, the artwork is very much of its time. And I feel like Paula's artwork really brought a contemporary sense of humor and of delight and of a little bit of a cartoonish line that more eloquently than words and translation can do, that show that this is really children's literature.
So, having talked about the book, can you share a brief excerpt from Honey on the Page and why it's important to understanding Yiddish children's literature?
Sure. So since I was just mentioning the sense of whimsy that Paula was able to bring, I'm actually going to share the story that produced her favorite one of her illustrations. This is from a story called A Deal's a Deal. We see Avram and Myrtle up in bed, and downstairs you see these robbers who look like the Hamburglar clearing out their home. This is a story by Shlomo Simon, or Solomon Simon, the great writer of folk tales, Chalm stories, whose grandson, David Foreman, has just released a volume of his grandfather's stories of the clever tailor. So this one is called A Deal's a Deal. It was a cold, rainy autumn night in Chelm. The wind had torn open door and shutters. In the middle of the night, Avram heard the door banging. So he woke up his wife Myrtle and said to her, "Wifey dear, did you lock the door?" Myrtle replied, "Hubby dear, I thought you had locked it. I didn't, said Avram. Go and lock it. You go and lock it, said Myrtle. Said Avram, no, I'm not going downstairs in this cold, and surely you know that when I say no, it's no. Said Myrtle, the whole world knows that when a man is a rabbi, his wife is called a rebbitzin. When a man is Mr. Shoemaker, then his wife is Mrs. Shoemaker. You're Mr. Stubborn, my husband, so that makes me Mrs. Stubborn. I, too, am staying in bed and not moving a muscle. Said Avram, what you say makes sense. You know what? Let's make a deal with each other that whichever one of us is first to speak will lock the door. Said Myrtle, deal. So they lay there in silence. The wind blew and the open door banged and banged until the house shuddered. But both of them kept quiet, and neither moved a muscle. The rain poured, the wind blew. Inside the house it was wet and cold enough to drive away wolves, but Avram and Myrtle didn't budge. Just before dawn, husband and wife heard footsteps and human voices. Thieves were talking. One thief said, just look at that open door. Let's go inside and see what we can lift. Said the second thief, don't talk so loud. Maybe the owners are home, but they're sleeping. Don't be ridiculous, answered the first one. You hear how the door's banging? That would wake the dead. Chances are nobody's home. Come on. Husband and wife heard the thieves come into the house and start to empty out all the rooms, but husband and wife didn't move a muscle. The thieves did their work and packed up everything they could get their hands on. Husband and wife knew their home would be left naked and bare, but they didn't let out a peep. The thieves gathered everything together and took off. They left the door open as they'd found it. So I will leave you a cliffhanger as to how the story proceeds and who wins the bet or the deal that they've made.
Sounds like a good episode for a TV program. You can see it, you just see it before your eyes.
So, let me put that out to the universe to just manifest. So many of these stories want to be animated. Whoever knows how to make it happen, please send me an email.
Well, there's that's a creative suggestion and a logical next step for the book. Well, the book is Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, edited and translated by Dr. Miriam Udel, and is available wherever you purchase books. Dr. Udel, it's been really a great pleasure. Thank you for being with us and sharing this unprecedented treasury of Yiddish literature.
I deeply appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Dr. Miriam Udel for joining me and bringing out the richness of Yiddish children's literature. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon.